The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Magnolia Estate, as my father's words echoed through the reception hall. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Zara." But it wasn't his public humiliation that destroyed me. It was when my new husband leaned close to my ear and whispered, "I know," because in that moment, I realized the man I'd just married, and the family who raised me had been planning my downfall together for months. My name is Zara Nightingale, and this is how I discovered that my wedding day wasn't a celebration. It was a carefully orchestrated heist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my wedding dawned gray and humid, typical Charleston weather that seemed to press against the windows of my carriage house like an unwelcome guest. I should have taken it as an omen. Instead, I stood in my bedroom, surrounded by layers of ivory silk and French lace, believing I was about to marry the love of my life. The dress had belonged to my grandmother Evangeline, the only woman in the Nightingale family who ever made me feel like I truly belonged. Its delicate pearl buttons climbed my spine like tiny promises, each one securing me into a legacy I thought was finally mine to claim. Isla Thorne, my best friend since college, worked behind me with the patience of a saint, her fingers steady despite the chaos that had become my morning routine. "You look like something out of a fairy tale," she murmured, adjusting the cathedral veil that had yellowed slightly with age but still caught the light, like captured moonbeams. In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back looked confident, radiant, ready to step into her new life as Mrs. Damien Ashworth. If only I had known what that life would actually cost me. Downstairs, I could hear the familiar sounds of my family preparing for what they called the social event of the season. The Nightingale Maritime Holdings had been Charleston royalty for 4 generations, and my wedding to Damien Ashworth was being treated like a merger between 2 shipping dynasties, which, I would later learn, was exactly what it was. My phone buzzed against the antique vanity, a text from Damien that made my heart flutter with the same nervous excitement I'd felt when he first kissed me on the Battery Promenade 18 months ago. "Can't wait to see you walking down that aisle, beautiful. Today changes everything." I smiled, pressing the phone to my chest like a schoolgirl. He was right. Today would change everything. Just not in the way either of us were pretending to expect. Cordelia Nightingale swept into my room without knocking, as was her custom. My mother had never learned the art of gentle entrances. She moved through the world like she owned it, which in Charleston society she essentially did. Her silver hair was pinned into a chignon so perfect it could have been carved from marble, and her champagne-colored gown probably cost more than most people's cars. She paused in the doorway, studying me with the same critical eye she used to evaluate real estate investment. "The photographer wants family portraits in 10 minutes, she announced, not bothering with pleasantries like asking how I felt or telling me I looked beautiful. "Your father is already complaining about the heat, and Vivienne needs to touch up her makeup after that crying spell over her speech." My sister Vivienne, 2 years older and perpetually treated like the crown jewel of the family, had insisted on giving a maid of honor speech, despite our relationship being more obligation than affection. She'd spent the past week rehearsing what she claimed would be a heartfelt tribute to our sisterly bond, though we both knew the truth was far more complicated. Vivienne had always been the daughter who fit perfectly into the Nightingale mold, sharp, ambitious, unquestioningly loyal to the family business. I was the one who asked too many questions, who wanted to paint instead of pursuing maritime law, who chose love over strategic alliance, or so I thought. "Where's Damien?" I asked, smoothing the silk of my skirt. I thought the photographer wanted couple shots before the ceremony. Something flickered across my mother's face, so quick I almost missed it. "He's handling some last-minute business with his father. Nothing for you to worry about, darling." Groom's responsibilities. Ela caught my eye in the mirror, her expression unreadable. She'd never been Damien's biggest fan, though she'd never been able to articulate why. "Just a feeling," she'd said when I pressed her about it months ago. "Something about the way he looks at you when you're not looking at him." I'd dismissed it as friend jealousy, the natural suspicion that comes when someone new enters a close relationship. Now I wish I'd listened. The Magnolia Estate sprawled across 30 acres of manicured gardens and centuries-old oak trees, draped in Spanish moss. It was the kind of venue that appeared in Southern Living magazine and charged accordingly. Every detail had been planned with military precision by Celeste Rivers, a wedding coordinator whose reputation for perfection was matched only by her talent for extracting extraordinary fees from wealthy families. The ceremony was set for 4 o'clock in the Rose Garden, followed by cocktails on the wraparound veranda and dinner in the grand ballroom. As I made my way downstairs, the house hummed with controlled chaos. Florists added final touches to arrangements that had cost more than some people's annual salaries. Caterers moved through the kitchen like dancers in a well-rehearsed ballet. Musicians tuned instruments in the parlor. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, a plan I was only beginning to understand. I'd never been truly part of. My father, Victor Nightingale, stood in the foyer checking his pocket watch with the same intensity he brought to board meeting. At 62, he remained an imposing figure. His silver hair perfectly styled, and his custom tuxedo tailored to hide the slight paunch that came with decades of business dinners and bourbon. He'd built the family shipping empire into something that rivaled the old Charleston fortunes, but he'd never quite shaken the hunger that drove him to succeed. Looking back, I should have recognized that hunger extended to everything in his life, including his daughter. "There's the bride," he said when he spotted me, his voice carrying the warm authority that had charmed business partners and intimidated competitors for decades. He kissed my cheek, careful not to disturb my makeup. "You look stunning, sweetheart. Evangeline would be proud." The mention of my grandmother sent a familiar pang through my chest. She'd passed away 3 years ago, leaving behind a legacy of kindness that had always felt at odds with the rest of the Nightingale family dynamic. Evangeline had been the one who encouraged my artistic pursuits, who told me stories about choosing love over expectation, who made me feel like being different wasn't something to be fixed. Her coastal cottage on Kiowa Island had been my refuge throughout childhood, the one place where I could be myself without apology or explanation. "I miss her," I said quietly, adjusting the vintage pearl necklace that had also been her. "She loved you very much," my father replied, though something in his tone suggested we should move away from sentimental territory. "Speaking of love, I need to have a quick word with you before the ceremony." He guided me into his study, a masculine sanctuary lined with maritime artifacts and family portraits that traced the Nightingale legacy back to the Civil War. The room smelled of leather and old cigars, a scent that had comforted me throughout childhood, but now seemed slightly suffocating. He closed the door behind us and I noticed his expression had shifted into something more serious. "Zara, I want you to know how happy your mother and I are about this marriage," he began, settling into the chair behind his mahogany desk. "Damien is exactly the kind of man this family needs. Ambitious, connected, committed to building something lasting." "I'm glad you approve," I said, though something in his phrasing felt odd. "The kind of man this family needs, not the kind of man I need." "The Ashworth partnership will open doors we've been trying to access for years," he continued. "Their international shipping contracts, combined with our domestic infrastructure, will position us perfectly for the next phase of expansion." "It's exactly what your grandfather envisioned when he started this company." I shifted uncomfortably, the wedding dress suddenly feeling heavier. "Dad, you're talking about my marriage like a business deal." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "Of course not, sweetheart. I'm simply saying that sometimes personal happiness and family prosperity align perfectly. Today is one of those days." A knock on the door interrupted whatever response I might have offered. Celeste Rivers peered in, her expression professionally urgent. "Miss Nightingale, we need the bride for photographs in 5 minutes. The timeline is very specific." As I stood to leave, my father caught my hand. "Zara, I need you to remember something today. Family loyalty means everything. Whatever happens, whatever you might hear or see, remember that everything we've done has been to protect what your great-grandfather built. Promise me you'll remember that." The request struck me as strange, but before I could ask what he meant, Celeste was ushering me toward the photographer's setup in the garden. The next hour passed in a blur of posed smiles and carefully arranged group family portraits that would hang in our homes for decades, capturing what everyone would remember as a perfect day. The photographer, A thin man with an artistic eye and expensive equipment directed us through combinations I hadn't expected. "Let's do one with just the bride and her parents," he suggested, "and then perhaps one with the business partners, Mr. Nightingale and Mr. Ashworth." Business partner. The phrase stuck in my mind as I watched my father and Damien's father, Sterling Ashworth, pose together with the easy familiarity of men who'd known each other far longer than the 18 months since Damien and I had started dating. Sterling was a tall, distinguished man with silver temples and the kind of old money confidence that came from generations of inherited wealth. His shipping company, Ashworth Maritime, had been the Nightingale family's biggest competitor for decades, until today, apparently. "How long have our fathers known each other?" I asked Damien during a brief break between photo sessions. He looked spectacular in his custom tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his green eyes bright with what I interpreted as wedding day excitement. "Oh, you know how it is in Charleston," he said, adjusting his bow tie. "Everyone knows everyone in the shipping business. They've been circling each other for years." It wasn't really an answer, but before I could press him, the photographer was calling for more shots. The afternoon sun slanted through the oak trees, creating the kind of golden light that would make every picture look like a magazine spread. I should have been blissfully happy. Instead, I found myself studying faces and conversations, trying to understand why everything felt slightly off-kilter. Vivian appeared at my elbow, resplendent in her dusty rose bridesmaid dress, and carrying a glass of champagne, despite the early hour. "You look nervous," she observed with the blunt honesty that had characterized our relationship since childhood. "It's my wedding day," I replied. "Nervous is normal, is it?" She took a sip of champagne, studying me over the rim of the glass. "Because you look more confused than nervous, like you're trying to solve a puzzle." Before I could respond, Lucinda Ashworth joined our conversation. Damien's mother was an elegant woman who'd maintained her figure and her social standing through decades of careful attention to both. She wore a navy dress that probably cost more than my car and a smile that never quite reached her eye. "Zara, darling, you look absolutely radiant," she said, though her gaze seemed to be cataloging details rather than admiring them. "I was just telling Sterling how perfect this arrangement is. Two families, finally united after all these years of competition. Another word that sent a chill down my spine despite the humid Charleston air. "I wouldn't call love an arrangement," I said carefully. Lucinda's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and slightly hollow. "Of course not, dear. I simply meant that it's wonderful when personal feelings align with practical considerations." Damien has always been so strategic in his choices. Strategic. I was beginning to hate that word. The cocktail hour before the ceremony was a carefully choreographed dance of Charleston society. Old families mingled with new money, business partnerships were discussed over bourbon and champagne, and everyone moved through the ritual with the practiced ease of people who'd been attending these events their entire lives. I found myself watching my fiancé work the crowd, noting how naturally he navigated conversations about shipping routes and international contracts, how easily he discussed business details I'd never heard him mention before. "You're being awfully quiet," Isla observed, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of champagne. She'd changed into her bridesmaid dress, a flowing creation in sage green that complemented her auburn hair perfectly. "Just taking it all in," I said, accepting the glass gratefully. "It's surreal, you know. In 2 hours I'll be married. Are you happy?" The question was simple, but something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. I opened my mouth to say yes automatically, then paused. Was I happy? Or was I simply going through the motions of what happiness was supposed to look like? "I think so," I said finally. "I mean, I love Damien. This is what I wanted. But, I keep feeling like I'm missing something, like there's a conversation happening around me that I'm not part of." Isla's expression grew more serious. "What kind of conversation?" Before I could explain, Celeste Rivers was clapping her hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could begin moving toward the garden, the ceremony will commence in 15 minutes. The next quarter hour passed in a carefully orchestrated flurry of final preparations. Vivian gave me a stiff hug and reminded me not to trip on my train. My mother adjusted my veil one final time, and told me to keep my shoulders back. My father appeared at my elbow, offering his arm with a smile that didn't quite mask something deeper in his expression. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked as the string quartet began the processional music. I nodded, though I wasn't sure ready was the right word. I felt like an actress who'd only read half the script, expected to perform a role I didn't fully understand. But the music was playing, the guests were seated, and Damien was waiting at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking like every bride's dream come true. As we reached the garden entrance, I caught sight of the assembled crowd, 200 of Charleston's most influential families, all turned toward the aisle with expectant faces. Business colleagues of both families, social connections spanning generations, politicians and philanthropists, and old money aristocrats, who'd been attending each other's milestone events for decades. They weren't here to witness a love story, I realized with sudden clarity. They were here to witness a merger. The realization should have stopped me in my tracks. Instead, I tightened my grip on my father's arm and stepped forward into whatever was waiting for me at the end of that rose-petal-strewn aisle. Because sometimes the only way to discover the truth is to walk directly into the trap that's been set for you. The ceremony itself passed like a dream sequence, beautiful and surreal and slightly disconnected from reality. Damien's vows spoke of partnership and building a future together. Mine spoke of love and trust and choosing each other every day. The officiant, a family friend who'd known both our families for decades, pronounced us husband and wife with the gravitas usually reserved for business contracts. When Damien kissed me, sealing our union in front of God and Charleston society, I felt a strange mix of joy and foreboding. The crowd erupted in applause, rose petals flew through the air, and the photographer captured what would become the official record of the moment my life changed forever. As we walked back down the aisle together, hands clasped and smiles fixed in place, I caught my father's eye in the crowd. He was applauding with everyone else, but his expression held something I couldn't quite identify. Pride, certainly, satisfaction, definite, but underneath it all was something that looked almost like relief, as if a particularly challenging business deal had finally been successfully closed. I squeezed Damien's hand, and he squeezed back, his smile bright and perfect for the camera. In a few hours I would understand exactly what that smile had been hiding, but for now, in this moment suspended between my old life and whatever was coming next, I allowed myself to believe that I had just married my soulmate, and stepped into the beginning of our happily ever after. The photographer arranged us for more portraits as the guests moved toward the cocktail reception. The golden hour light was perfect, the Spanish moss created a romantic backdrop, and every shot would be magazine-worthy. I posed and smiled and tried to ignore the growing sense that I was participating in an elaborate performance, rather than celebrating the most important day of my life. "You look beautiful, Miss Ashworth," Damien murmured during a brief break between shots, and the name sent a thrill through me, despite everything else. Mrs. Ashworth. After years of being the daughter who didn't quite fit the Nightingale mold, I finally had a new identity to grow into. If only I had known what that identity would actually require me to become. As the sun began to set over the Magnolia Estate, casting everything in the warm glow that made Charleston famous, I prepared to join my wedding reception as a married woman. The next few hours would bring revelations that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the price of belonging to something larger than yourself. But, in that moment, with my hand in my new husband's and my grandmother's dress rustling around my ankles, I still believed that the hardest part was over. I still believed that I had chosen my own future. I had no idea that my future had been chosen for me long before I ever met the man I'd just promised to love, honor and cherish until death do us part. The reception hall glittered like something from a fairy tale, all crystal chandeliers and candlelight reflecting off polished silver. Round tables draped in ivory linens surrounded a dance floor that gleamed under the soft glow of hundreds of candles. Magnolia blossoms cascaded from towering centerpieces, their sweet fragrance mingling with the scent of expensive perfume and aged bourbon. It was everything I had dreamed of for my wedding reception, down to the last perfectly placed detail. I should have been floating on air. Instead, I found myself studying faces and fragments of conversations, trying to piece together a puzzle I didn't even know existed. As Damien and I made our grand entrance to thunderous applause, I caught sight of my father and Sterling Ashworth sharing what looked like a knowing glance. They stood together near the bar, bourbon glasses in hand, their body language suggesting a familiarity that went far beyond polite business acquaintance. The first dance was supposed to be magical. Damien had chosen At Last by Etta James, a song that had played during our third date when we danced in my kitchen while making dinner together. Now, as he spun me around the dance floor with practiced precision, I couldn't shake the feeling that even this intimate moment was being performed for an audience that expected a specific show. "You're tense," he murmured against my ear as we swayed to the music. "Relax, beautiful. This is our night." "I'm just overwhelmed," I replied, though that wasn't quite accurate. Overwhelmed suggested too much of a good thing. This felt more like drowning in something I couldn't identify. "It's all so perfect is what you deserve," he said, dipping me dramatically as the song reached its crescendo. The crowd burst into applause, and I caught Vivienne watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something calculating in her gaze, as if she was evaluating our performance rather than enjoying her sister's happiness. As the evening progressed, I began to notice patterns that made my chest tighten with unease. Conversations would stop when I approached, only to resume in hushed tones once I moved away. Business cards were exchanged with unusual frequency for a wedding reception. Most disturbing of all, several guests made comments about the brilliant timing of our union, as if our marriage had been scheduled to coincide with something else entirely. During the cocktail hour, I overheard Marcus Whitfield, our family lawyer, talking to a man I didn't recognize. "The paperwork should be finalized by Monday," Marcus was saying. "Once the marriage certificate is filed, the trust transfers automatically." Brilliant strategy, really. No one can contest it now. Trust transfers. The words sent ice through my veins despite the warm Charleston evening. I thought about my grandmother's will, the coastal cottage on Kiowa Island that she'd left specifically to me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The property had been tied up in legal complications for years. Something about trust structures and family holdings that I'd never fully understood. My father had always assured me it would be mine eventually, that the lawyers were simply working through complex inheritance laws. I excused myself from a conversation with some distant cousins and found Isla near the dessert table, carefully avoiding the elaborate wedding cake that towered like a white monument to matrimonial excess. Her expression brightened when she saw me, but I noticed the concern lurking behind her smile. "Having fun at your own party?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Can I ask you something?" I kept my voice low, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Have you noticed anything strange tonight? About the way people are talking?" Isla's expression grew more serious. "What kind of strange?" "Business talk. Lots of business talk. More than seems normal for a wedding reception." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "And comments about timing, like our marriage was planned to coincide with something else." She was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting across the reception hall to where my father and Sterling Ashworth were deep in conversation with several other men I recognized as shipping industry executives. "Now that you mention it, yes. I've been getting a weird vibe all evening. Like there's something everyone knows except you." Before I could respond, Celeste Rivers appeared at my elbow with her ever-present clipboard and professional smile. "Mrs. Ashworth, we need you and your husband for the cake cutting in 5 minutes. After that, your father wants to give his speech." Mrs. Ashworth, the name still felt foreign on my tongue, like clothing that didn't quite fit properly. I nodded and followed Celeste toward the elaborate cake, a 4-tier confection decorated with sugar magnolias and real pearl. Damien appeared beside me, flashing that perfect smile that had charmed me from our very first meeting. The cake cutting proceeded with all the expected fanfare. We fed each other delicate bites while the photographer captured every moment. The crowd laughed and applauded, and everything looked exactly like it was supposed to look. But when Damien's hand covered mine on the knife handle, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. His wedding ring, a simple platinum band that matched mine, bore an engraving on the inside. I caught a glimpse of it as he adjusted his grip, Strategic Alliance 2020. Strategic alliance, like we were corporate partners rather than newlyweds. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, but I kept smiling, kept playing my part in whatever performance this had become. Around us, the reception continued in its choreographed perfection, but I felt like I was watching it all from underwater, every sound muffled and every movement slightly distorted. My father's speech was scheduled for after the cake cutting, followed by Vivienne's maid of honor toast. As the crowd gathered around, champagne glasses raised in anticipation, I noticed that both speeches had been written on formal stationery rather than the casual note cards most wedding speakers used. This wasn't improvised sentiment, it was prepared remark. Victor Nightingale stepped up to the microphone with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. He looked distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, every inch the successful patriarch celebrating his daughter's marriage. But as he began to speak, his words sent chills down my spine. Friends, family, and esteemed colleagues, he began, his voice carrying easily across the reception hall. Tonight we celebrate not just the union of two young people in love, but the joining of two families who have shaped Charleston's maritime industry for generations. Joining of two families. I glanced at Damien, but his expression remained perfectly composed, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. The Nightingale and Ashworth families have been competitors for decades. My father continued, but we've always shared a vision of Charleston's potential as a premier international shipping destination. Tonight's celebration marks the beginning of a new chapter, one where competition gives way to collaboration. The crowd murmured appreciatively, but I felt like I was hearing a foreign language. This wasn't a father celebrating his daughter's happiness. This was a businessman announcing a merger. Zara has always been our most precious investment, he said, and the word choice made my stomach clench. Investment, not daughter. Investment, not beloved child. Her marriage to Damien represents the culmination of years of careful planning and strategic position. Together, these two remarkable young people will build something greater than either family could achieve alone. Strategic positioning. Years of careful planning. The words echoed in my head as the crowd applauded politely. I looked around the room, searching for someone who seemed as confused as I felt, but every face reflected satisfaction and approval. They all knew. Whatever this was, whatever my marriage actually represented, everyone knew except me. When my father raised his glass for the toast, his next words shattered what remained of my illusions about this perfect evening. To Zara and Damien, he said, his voice warm with paternal pride that now sounded completely false. May your union bring prosperity to both families and secure the Nightingale legacy for generations to come. And may the trust transfers that finalize on Monday morning mark the beginning of a new era for Charleston maritime commerce. Trust transfers that finalize on Monday morning. The room erupted in applause and cheers, but I felt like I was falling through the floor. My grandmother's cottage. The inheritance that had been tied up in legal complications for years. The property was being transferred not to me but through me, to my new husband and his family. I turned to look at Damien, expecting to see confusion or surprise on his face. Instead, I found him smiling and nodding as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. When he caught my eye, his expression shifted slightly, and for just a moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of a groom celebrating his new marriage, but the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly as intended. Vivienne's maid of honor speech followed immediately, and her words confirmed what I was beginning to understand with growing horror. I've had the privilege of watching this romance blossom, she said, though I couldn't remember her ever showing much interest in my relationship with Damien. From the very first time Damien visited our family offices to discuss potential partnerships, I knew he was someone special. His vision for integrating our family businesses aligned perfectly with our own goals for expansion. Family offices, potential partnership. This wasn't the language of sisterly affection, it was the language of corporate strategy. And the timeline she was describing didn't match my memory of how Damien and I had met. According to Vivienne, he'd been visiting Nightingale Maritime Holdings to discuss business partnerships before we'd even started dating. Zara may not have realized it at the time, Vivian continued with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, but she was always destined to play a crucial role in our family's future. Her inheritance from grandmother Evangeline provides exactly the collateral needed for our next phase of expansion. Thanks to her marriage to Damien, that expansion can finally begin. Collateral. My inheritance was being used as collateral, and my marriage was the mechanism that made it possible. I felt like I might vomit right there in front of 200 wedding guests. Every romantic moment, every declaration of love, every carefully planned detail of our relationship had been orchestrated to position me for this moment. As Vivian raised her glass for her toast, I caught sight of Aunt Petra near the edge of the crowd. My father's sister had always been the family member most willing to speak uncomfortable truths, and her expression tonight was troubled. When our eyes met, she gave me a look that seemed to say she wanted to talk, but not here, not now, not in front of all these witnesses to my elaborate betrayal. The toasts concluded with thunderous applause and calls for the bride and groom to kiss. Damien leaned in to kiss me, and I forced myself to respond appropriately, though his lips felt like ice against mine. When he pulled back, he whispered something that made my knees nearly buckle. "You look like you're starting to understand," he said quietly, his words masked by the crowd's cheering. "Don't worry, beautiful. The hard part is over now. All you have to do is play along." Play along, as if our entire marriage was a performance and I'd finally been given my real script. I stared at him, this man I'd promised to love and honor and cherish, and saw a stranger looking back at me. Not just a stranger, but someone who'd been lying to me from the moment we met. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical responses. I danced with my new husband, posed for more photographs, and accepted congratulations from guests who seemed to understand the significance of this evening better than I did. Every conversation felt like it was happening in code, with references to partnerships and consolidations and strategic advantages that went completely over my head. During a brief break in the festivities, I escaped to the ladies' room, desperate for a moment alone to process what I was learning. But even there, I wasn't safe from revelations. As I stood in front of the ornate mirror, trying to compose myself, I overheard two women talking in the lounge area just outside the bathroom stalls. Brilliant move by Victor, one of them was saying, using the daughter's inheritance to secure the merger without having to give up controlling interest in Nightingale Maritime. The Ashworths get the coastal properties they've been wanting for decades, the other replied, and the Nightingales get access to international shipping. Everyone wins, except the daughter, the first woman said with a laugh that sounded cruel, though I suppose she gets a handsome husband out of the deal. Could be worse, except the daughter. The words echoed in my head as I stood frozen in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection in my grandmother's wedding dress. The pearls at my throat suddenly felt like a noose, and the elaborate updo that had taken hours to perfect felt like a costume I was wearing for someone else's benefit. I returned to the reception on unsteady legs, my smile feeling more brittle with each passing moment. Damien was waiting for me near our sweetheart table, looking every inch the devoted groom. But now I could see the calculation behind his green eyes, the way he monitored my reactions and adjusted his behavior accordingly. "Everything all right?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Perfect," I managed, though the word tasted like ash in my mouth. As the evening wound down, guests began to leave with effusive congratulations and promises to see us soon. Business cards continued to change hands, and I heard multiple references to Monday morning meetings and pending contracts. Whatever had been set in motion by our marriage would apparently waste no time in moving forward. Lucinda Ashworth appeared at my side as I was saying goodbye to some distant relatives, her smile as perfectly maintained as her appearance. "Welcome to the family, darling," she said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt like ice. "I do hope you'll adjust quickly to your new role. There's so much work to be done, and we're counting on your cooperation." New role, cooperation. The words sent another chill through me, but before I could ask what she meant, she was gliding away toward the exit, her navy dress rustling like promises I didn't understand. By midnight, most of the guests had departed, leaving only family and a few close friends to oversee the cleanup. I stood in the nearly empty reception hall, surrounded by the detritus of what everyone kept calling the perfect wedding, and felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Damien was across the room, deep in conversation with his father and mine, their heads bent together over what looked like legal documents. Occasionally one of them would glance in my direction, and I caught fragments of their discussion that made my blood run cold. Monday morning transfer, Sterling was saying, clean and legal, no way to contest it after the fact. The cottage properties will provide excellent collateral for the international expansion, my father replied. Exactly what we needed to move forward. And the girl won't be a problem? Lucinda asked, joining their huddle. She's always been compliant, my father said with casual dismissal. A romantic. She'll adjust to reality soon enough. Compliant. Romantic. A girl who would adjust to reality. They were talking about me like I was a business asset rather than a human being with feelings and desires and the right to make my own choices about my life. I thought about grandmother Evangeline's cottage, the place where I'd spent the happiest moments of my childhood, the wraparound porch where she'd taught me to paint watercolors, the garden where we'd planted herbs together, the library where she'd read me stories about brave women who chose their own destiny. She'd left it to me specifically, with handwritten notes about how it should remain a sanctuary for creativity and independence. Now it was being used as collateral for a business deal I'd never agreed to, transferred through a marriage I was beginning to understand had been arranged for exactly this purpose. As I stood there in my grandmother's wedding dress, surrounded by the remnants of what I'd believed was the happiest day of my life, I finally understood what Damien had meant when he whispered that I was starting to understand. I wasn't a bride. I was a signature on a contract. I wasn't a beloved daughter. I was a strategic asset. I wasn't a wife. I was a means to an end. The realization should have brought tears, but instead, it brought something colder and sharp. If they thought I would simply adjust to reality and play along with their plans, they had seriously underestimated Evangeline, Nightingale's granddaughter. The cleanup crew worked efficiently around us, dismantling the fairy tale setting with practiced ease. Within hours there would be no trace of this elaborate performance, nothing left but photographs and memories and legal documents that would reshape two family empires. But as I watched my new husband shake hands with my father like business partners concluding a successful negotiation, I made a promise to myself and to my grandmother's memory. They might have used me to get what they wanted, but they had also given me something they hadn't intended, a legal position within both families that could be leveraged in ways they hadn't considered. If they wanted to play games with trust funds and property transfers and strategic marriages, then I would learn to play those games better than they ever imagined, because sometimes the best way to win a game you didn't know you were playing is to change the rules entirely. The last guests finally departed, leaving only immediate family to survey the aftermath of our perfect wedding. Tomorrow I would begin to understand exactly what my new role as Mrs. Damien Ashworth actually entailed. But tonight, as I stood in the ruins of my romantic illusions, I started planning my own strategic moves. After all, they had taught me well. Family loyalty meant everything. My father had always said. I was about to show them exactly what loyalty looked like when it was freely given rather than purchased with lies and manipulation. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The honeymoon suite at the Ocean House had been decorated with rose petals and champagne, a romantic gesture that now felt like mockery. Damien closed the door behind us with a soft click that sounded final, like the closing of a trap. I stood near the window, still wearing my grandmother's wedding dress, watching the moonlight dance on Charleston Harbor while my new husband moved around the room with the casual confidence of someone who had gotten exactly what he wanted. You can drop the act now, he said, loosening his bow tie with practiced ease. The performance is over. I turned to face him, this stranger I'd just married, and saw him clearly for the first time. Without the wedding crowd and cameras, without the need to maintain appearances, his entire demeanor had shifted. The adoring groom had vanished, replaced by someone calculating and cold. What act? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The confused bride routine, he replied, sitting on the edge of the massive four-poster bed to remove his shoes. You figured it out during the reception. I could see it in your face when your father gave his speech. The casual way he discussed my devastation was almost more shocking than the revelation itself. I had expected denials, explanations, maybe even remorse. Instead, he was treating my emotional destruction like a minor inconvenience that could now be dispensed with. How long? The question came out as barely a whisper. How long what? He stood and walked to the minibar, pouring himself a scotch as if we were discussing the weather. How long have you been lying to me? He paused, glass halfway to his lips, and actually smiled. Lying is such an ugly word, Zara. I prefer strategic omission. Answer the question. From the beginning, he said with a shrug that made my stomach lurch. The coffee shop, the accidental meeting, the mutual friends who introduced us, all of it was carefully planned. Your father and mine have been negotiating this arrangement for 2 years. 2 years. I thought about our 18-month relationship, every moment I'd treasured, every milestone I'd celebrated, our first kiss on the Battery, the weekend we'd spent painting my apartment, the night he'd proposed on the rooftop of the Charleston Place Hotel, with the city sparkling below us like scattered diamonds. All of it had been a performance designed to manipulate me into this moment. The proposal, I said, my voice barely audible. You said you loved me. I'm fond of you, he replied with clinical detachment. You're beautiful, intelligent, and you have a certain naive charm that I find moderately entertaining. But, love? He laughed, a sound that cut through me like broken glass. Love is a luxury neither of our families can afford. I sank into the silk upholstered chair by the window, my grandmother's dress pooling around me like spilled milk. Why me? Vivienne is the obvious choice for family business. She's older, more involved in maritime operations, more willing to play political game. Vivienne doesn't have the inheritance, Damien said matter-of-factly. Your grandmother specifically left the Kiowa properties to you, 40 acres of prime coastal real estate, perfect for the deepwater port expansion we've been planning. Without those properties, the entire international shipping venture falls apart. So you married me for land, I married you for strategic positioning, he corrected, as if the distinction mattered. The land is just part of your signature on the trust documents, gives us legal access to assets worth approximately $50 million. Your position as my wife prevents you from contesting the transfers. Your compliance ensures smooth integration of our business operations. Compliance. That word again, spoken like it was something I owed him, and if I don't comply, his expression grew colder, though I wouldn't have thought that possible. Then you'll discover how unpleasant life can become for someone who tries to obstruct legitimate business interests. Your family has worked very hard to build their reputation in Charleston society. It would be unfortunate if that reputation were to suffer due to your poor judgment. The threat was delivered with the same casual tone he'd used to discuss the weather, but its implications were crystal clear. Step out of line, and they would destroy not just me but the family name that had been built over generations. I need some air, I said, standing abruptly. The wedding dress rustled around me, a sound that had seemed magical hours earlier, and now felt like chains. By all means, Damien said, settling into an armchair with his scotch. But remember, Mrs. Ashworth, you have obligations now. The merger announcement goes public Monday morning, and there will be press conferences, photo opportunities, social events. Your performance will need to be flawless. I left the suite without another word, my heels clicking on the marble floors as I made my way to the hotel's garden terrace. The night air was thick with humidity and the scent of Confederate jasmine, but it felt cleaner than the suffocating atmosphere of that room. I found a secluded bench near the fountain and finally allowed myself to process the magnitude of what had happened. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment, I hoped it might be from someone who cared about me as a person rather than an asset. Instead, it was from my mother. Lovely ceremony, darling. Don't forget the Maritime Association brunch tomorrow, at 11. Wear the blue Chanel suit. Even my mother's first communication, after my wedding, was about business appearances and wardrobe choices. I stared at the message, remembering all the times she'd criticized my clothing, my career choices, my lack of interest in family business politics. Now I understood that every criticism had been about molding me into someone who could fulfill this specific role. Couldn't sleep either? I looked up to find Aunt Petra approaching the bench, her silver hair gleaming in the moonlight. She'd changed out of her formal wedding attire into comfortable slacks and a cotton blouse, looking more like the woman who'd taken me tide pooling as a child than the polished society matron she'd been at the reception. Petra, I said, relief flooding through me. If anyone would tell me the truth, it would be my father's sister. May I sit? She asked, gesturing to the bench beside me. I nodded, and she settled next to me with a heavy sigh. For several minutes, we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fountain and the distant sounds of the city settling into sleep. You know, she said finally, don't you? About the business arrangement. About the fact that my marriage is actually a merger disguised as romance. Yes, I figured it out. Petra was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. I tried to warn your father that this was wrong, manipulating you this way, using your inheritance as collateral without your knowledge. It goes against everything Evangeline believed in. You knew, I said, though it wasn't really a question. I suspected, she corrected. The timeline was too convenient. Damien's sudden interest in our family, the expedited courtship, the pressure to finalize your grandmother's estate. But I hoped I was wrong. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? She asked gently. You were so happy, so in love. If I'd tried to convince you that your Prince Charming was actually after your inheritance, you would have thought I was jealous or bitter. She was right, and we both knew it. I had been completely caught up in the romance, the fairy tale of finding true love in a world that often felt cold and calculating. The irony was almost unbearable. What do I do now? I asked, hating how helpless I sounded. That depends. Petra, do you want to be a victim, or do you want to be a player? The question surprised me. What do you mean? Your father and the Ashworths think they've been very clever, she said, a hint of steel creeping into her voice. They've arranged a marriage that gives them access to your inheritance, and positions you as a compliant wife who will smile prettily at photo opportunities. But they've also given you something they didn't intend. Which is legal standing. As Damien's wife, you now have access to Ashworth family financial records. As your grandmother's heir, you have certain rights that can't be signed away, even through marriage, and as a Nightingale, you have resources they're counting on you not to use. I stared at her, beginning to understand what she was suggesting. You're talking about fighting back. I'm talking about using the same tactics they used against you, she said firmly. They researched your vulnerabilities, exploited your emotions, and positioned you as a pawn in their business strategy. There's nothing stopping you from doing the same thing to them. I don't know how to play those kinds of games. Then you'll learn. Petra, your grandmother didn't leave you that cottage just because she loved you, Zara. She left it to you because she knew you had the strength to protect it. She saw something in you that the rest of the family missed. I thought about Evangeline's cottage, the place where I'd learned to paint and dream, and believe in possibilities beyond Charleston society's expectations. The idea of it being used as collateral for business deals she would have despised made anger flare in my chest. Where would I even start? With information, Petra said. They've shown you their hand by making this marriage happen. Now you need to understand exactly what they're planning and find the weaknesses in their strategy. And how do I do that? She smiled, and for the first time since the wedding ceremony, I saw something resembling hope. Your new husband has just given you access to both family businesses. Use it. We talked for another hour, Petra sharing insights about family dynamics and business relationships that I'd never understood before. She explained how the inheritance trust actually worked, what rights I maintained even as a married woman, and how the coastal properties could be leveraged in ways my father and the Ashworths might not have considered. By the time I returned to the honeymoon suite, Damien was asleep, sprawled across the bed in expensive pajamas like he owned the world. I stood in the doorway watching him. This man who'd spent 18 months convincing me he loved me while planning to use me as a business asset. The sight of him sleeping so peacefully after destroying my illusions about love and family made something hard and cold settle in my chest. I spent the rest of the night in the sitting room, still wearing my wedding dress, planning my next move. If they wanted to treat me like a business asset, then I would start thinking like one. But unlike them, I wouldn't be satisfied with mere compliance. I would demand controlling interest. The Maritime Association brunch the next morning was held at the Country Club of Charleston, an institution so old and exclusive that membership was still passed down through generations like family heirloom. I arrived wearing the blue Chanel suit my mother had specified, playing the role of the radiant newlywed, while studying every conversation and interaction with new eyes. Damien played his part perfectly, standing close to me with his hand possessively on my lower back, smiling adoringly whenever cameras appeared. To outside observers, we looked like the perfect power couple, two young people madly in love and perfectly positioned to carry on their families' legacies. "You're learning quickly," he murmured during a brief break between photo opportunities. "Learning what?" "How to perform," he said. "Your smile is much more convincing today." I turned to look at him, letting my expression soften into something that might have passed for affection. I had an excellent teacher. Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty perhaps, but before he could respond, we were approached by a group of maritime industry executives eager to discuss the upcoming merger announcement. The conversations that followed were revealing in ways my wedding reception discussions hadn't. Now that the marriage was finalized, people spoke more freely about their expectations and concerns. I learned about shipping routes and international contracts, about regulatory challenges and competitive advantage. Most importantly, I learned about the specific properties and assets that were being used to secure various aspects of the deal. "The Kiowa properties are crucial," one executive was telling Sterling Ashworth. "Without that deep water access, the entire Asian expansion falls apart. The environmental impact studies alone will take months," another added. "Any delays in securing the land rights could push the timeline back by years." Environmental impact study. I filed that information away, beginning to understand that the path to developing my grandmother's coastal properties might not be as straightforward as everyone assumed. During a break in the formal presentations, I excused myself to visit the ladies' room, but instead made my way to the club's business center. The computer terminals were outdated but functional, and I quickly logged into my personal email account to send myself a list of everything I'd overheard about the development plans. Doing research, I spun around to find Vivienne standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She'd always been able to move silently when she wanted to, a skill that had made childhood hide-and-seek games frustrating, and apparently made adult espionage possible. "Just checking messages," I said, quickly closing the browser window. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "You know, I was wondering when you'd start asking questions about the business arrangements." "What arrangements?" Vivienne laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Please, Zara, I saw your face during Dad's speech last night. You figured out that your romantic wedding was actually a corporate merger. There was no point in pretending anymore." "How long have you known?" "From the beginning," she said with a shrug. "I helped plan most of it. The initial research on Damien's background, the strategic introduction through mutual friends, the timeline for the courtship and engagement. The casual way she discussed orchestrating my emotional manipulation was almost worse than Damien's cold calculation. At least he was a stranger who'd been paid to deceive me. Vivienne was my sister. "Why?" The question came out barely audible. "Because it was necessary," she said, as if that explained everything. "The Ashworth Alliance gives us access to shipping routes we've been trying to break into for decades. Your inheritance provides the collateral for international expansion. The merger positions both families to dominate East Coast maritime commerce for the next generation. And my feeling? My life? My right to choose my own future? You were always going to marry someone from our social circle," Vivienne said dismissively. "At least this way, your marriage serves a greater purpose than just producing grandchildren for charity gala." The callousness of her response took my breath away. "We're sisters, Vivienne. We're supposed to protect each other." "I am protecting you," she said. "I'm protecting your position in this family, and ensuring you have a role in our future success. Without this marriage, you would have remained the artistic daughter who paints pretty pictures while the rest of us handle real responsibilities. And with this marriage, you become a key player in a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You gain access to resources and opportunities you could never achieve on your own. You secure your financial future and maintain your social standing. In exchange for my freedom, freedom is overrated, Vivian said. Security and influence are what matter in the real world. I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in our lives. She wasn't just complicit in this arrangement, she was its architect. While I'd been planning a wedding and dreaming about marriage, she'd been orchestrating a business deal that would reshape both our families. Does it bother you at all? I asked. What you've done to me, what I've done for you, she corrected. And no, it doesn't bother me. It's business, Zara. Personal feelings are a luxury we can't afford when family legacies are at stake. She left me alone in the business center, and I sat there for several minutes processing the depth of betrayal I was discovering. It wasn't just Damien who'd been lying to me, or even my parents who'd been manipulating me. My own sister had been pulling strings behind the scenes, treating my life like a chess piece to be moved around the board for maximum strategic advantage. When I finally returned to the brunch, I noticed things I'd missed before. The way business associates spoke about the Nightingale girl as if I were a commodity rather than a person. The way my parents monitored my interactions, ready to intervene if I said anything that might complicate their plan. The way Damien's family treated me with polite interest rather than genuine warmth, like a newly acquired asset that needed to be properly managed. But I also noticed opportunities, conversations about regulatory challenges that could delay development plans, mentions of environmental groups that opposed coastal construction projects, references to historical preservation societies that protected properties like my grandmother's cottage from commercial development. By the time the brunch ended, I had a much clearer picture of what I was up against, and what weapons I might have available to fight back. They had used my emotions and my trust to manipulate me into marriage. Now I would use their greed and overconfidence to turn the table. The drive back to our new home was conducted in silence. Damien had purchased a historic mansion in the Battery District, complete with period furniture and harbor view. It was the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines and tour guides, beautiful and impressive and completely soulless. Your things have been moved from your apartment, he said, as we pulled into the circular driveway. I had your studio set up in the third-floor turret room. The light should be adequate for your painting. The casual assumption that I would continue my art as a hobby while he managed real business was infuriating, but I kept my expression neutral. How thoughtful. I also had a desk installed in the master bedroom for when you need to review contracts or sign documents related to family business. Your new role will require significant paperwork. New role. More corporate language for what used to be called marriage. Inside the house I found my personal belongings arranged with museum-like precision. My clothes had been hung in the master bedroom closet according to color and season. My books were shelved in the library according to subject matter. My art supplies were neatly organized in the turret studio, positioned to take advantage of the northern light. Everything was perfectly arranged and completely impersonal, like a stage set designed to look like someone's home without actually being one. The merger announcement is scheduled for 10 tomorrow morning, Damien said, loosening his tie as he headed toward his study. We'll need to leave here by 9:30 for the press conference at the Harbor Plaza Hotel. Wear something that photographs well but not too flashy. We want to project stability and competence. I nodded and made appropriate responses, but my mind was elsewhere. Tomorrow's press conference would make the merger public knowledge, but it would also provide opportunities for questions from reporters who might not be as easily controlled as wedding guests and society brunches. That evening, while Damien worked in his study on merger-related documents, I explored my new home with the eye of someone looking for tactical advantages rather than aesthetic appreciation. The house was beautiful, but it was also old, with quirks and hidden features that someone more familiar with its history might be able to explore. In the library I found legal documents related to the property purchase, including surveys and title searches that revealed interesting information about easements and historical designation. In the kitchen I discovered that the previous owners had left behind more than just period furniture. They'd also left behind contact information for contractors, maintenance services, and legal advisors who specialized in historic property management. Most interesting of all, in a desk drawer in what had apparently been the previous owner's study, I found business cards for environmental lawyers, historic preservation consultants, and coastal protection advocates. People who might be very interested to learn about development plans for protected coastal properties. As I sat in the turret studio that night, surrounded by my art supplies and looking out over Charleston Harbor, I began to formulate a plan. They had used my love and trust to manipulate me into marriage. They had treated me like a naive romantic who would quietly accept whatever role they assigned me. They were about to learn that Evangeline Nightingale's granddaughter was neither naive nor romantic. I was something far more dangerous. I was a woman with nothing left to lose, and everything to gain by fighting back. The merger announcement tomorrow would mark the beginning of their victory celebration. It would also mark the beginning of my counterattack. The merger announcement press conference was staged at the Harbor Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Charleston's historic harbor. Media representatives filled neat rows of chairs while photographers positioned themselves for optimal shots of the two maritime families officially joining forces. I stood beside Damien on the raised platform wearing a navy blazer and pearl necklace that projected exactly the image of refined competence his family had requested. But beneath my composed exterior I was cataloging every detail, every face, every question that might provide leverage for what I was planning. The press packet distributed to attendees contained financial projections, expansion timelines, and environmental impact assessments that I studied with the intensity of someone preparing for battle rather than celebrating a business achievement. Victor Nightingale stepped up to the podium first, his silver hair gleaming under the television lights, as he delivered remarks that had clearly been prepared by professional speechwriter. Today marks a historic moment for Charleston's maritime industry, he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and social gatherings alike. The merger of Nightingale Maritime Holdings and Ashworth International represents the largest shipping consolidation in South Carolina's history. The journalists scribbled notes and adjusted recording devices, but I noticed that several of them looked bored, as if they'd covered similar announcements countless times before. Corporate mergers were business news, not front-page material unless something unexpected happened to make them newsworthy. Sterling Ashworth took the podium next, outlining expansion plans that relied heavily on the coastal properties I was beginning to understand were far more valuable and complicated than anyone had initially revealed. The integration of historic Kiowa Island properties into our deepwater port development will position Charleston as the premier East Coast gateway for Asian shipping routes, he announced with practiced confidence. Historic Kiowa Island property. The phrase sent a chill through me as I realized he was talking about my grandmother's cottage and the surrounding acreage she'd specifically left to me. Properties that were apparently central to development plans I'd never been consulted about, despite being their legal owner. When the floor opened for questions, most of the inquiries focused on financial projections and regulatory approval. But then a young journalist from the Charleston Environmental Observer raised her hand, and something about her expression suggested she'd done more research than the typical business reporter. "Miss Chen," Sterling acknowledged, reading her name from the press list. "Thank you. I'm wondering about the environmental impact studies mentioned in your development timeline. The Kiowa properties you're planning to develop include protected wetlands and nesting areas for several endangered bird species. How do you plan to address concerns from environmental groups who oppose coastal development in sensitive ecological areas?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I noticed both my father and Sterling exchange glances that suggested this wasn't something they'd expected to address publicly. Damien shifted beside me, his hand finding mine in what looked like a supportive gesture but felt more like a warning to remain silent. "We're committed to working within all environmental regulations," Sterling replied smoothly, but his answer was vague enough to suggest he didn't actually know what those regulations entailed. "And what about the South Carolina Coastal Protection Act?" The journalist pressed. "Properties with historical designation require special permits for any commercial development. Has the family that inherited these properties agreed to the development plan?" Every head in the room turned toward me, and I felt the weight of dozens of cameras and recording devices suddenly focused on my response. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. the opportunity to begin dismantling the careful plans that had been made without my knowledge or consent? That's an excellent question, I said, stepping closer to the microphone despite Damien's attempt to pull me back. As the legal inheritor of the Kiowa properties, I haven't actually seen any environmental impact studies or development proposals. This is the first I'm hearing about plans to use my grandmother's land for commercial port expansion. The room erupted in a buzz of confused murmurs and frantic note-taking. This wasn't the scripted response anyone had expected, and I could see panic spreading across the faces of both families as reporters realized there might be a more interesting story here than a simple business merger. Zara, my father said, his voice carrying a warning that only I would recognize. Perhaps we should discuss the technical details privately rather than in a public forum. Actually, I think transparency is important when discussing environmental protection, I replied, maintaining my composure despite the fury I could see building in his eyes. Especially when dealing with protected coastal properties that have been in my family for generations. More hands shot up among the press corps, and I could see the carefully controlled narrative of the merger announcement beginning to unravel in real time. This was exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd spent the previous evening researching environmental protection laws and coastal development regulations. Mrs. Ashworth, another journalist called out, "Are you saying you weren't consulted about development plans for property you legally own?" "I'm saying that my grandmother left those properties to me with specific instructions about preserving their natural state," I said, my voice growing stronger as I realized the power of speaking truth in a room full of people paid to report it. Any development plans would need my explicit approval, which hasn't been requested. The press conference devolved into chaos as reporters shouted questions about property rights, environmental violations, and family dispute. Damien finally managed to pull me away from the microphone, but the damage was done. What was supposed to be a celebration of business acumen had become a public relations disaster that would be front-page news in both business and environmental publications. "You stupid, naive little girl," Damien hissed in my ear as we were hustled off the platform by both families' legal teams. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" "I've told the truth," I replied calmly. "Something you might want to try sometime." The ride back to our Battery District mansion was conducted in tense silence, with Damien making heated phone calls to damage control specialists, while I stared out the window and watched Charleston's historic district roll past. I'd fired the first shot in what was clearly going to be a protracted battle, but I felt more energized than frightened. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with calls from environmental lawyers, coastal protection advocates, and journalists who wanted to understand the full scope of what was happening with the Kiowa property. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but I carefully noted the names and organizations of people who might become useful allies in the fight ahead. That evening, while Damien was closeted in his study with teams of lawyers and public relations consultants, I received an unexpected visitor. Aunt Petra arrived at our front door, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that mixed concern with something that looked suspiciously like pride. "I saw the press conference," she said as I led her into the library safely away from Damien's crisis management session. "Quite a performance." "It wasn't a performance," I said. "It was the truth." "Even better," she replied, settling into one of the leather armchairs that came with the historic house. "Truth has a way of being more powerful than any strategic planning." We talked for over an hour about the legal implications of what I'd revealed at the press conference. Petra had been doing her own research into the environmental protections surrounding the Kiowa properties, and what she'd discovered was even more promising than I'd hoped. "Your grandmother was smarter than any of us realized," Petra explained, pulling legal documents from her purse. "When she updated her will 3 years ago, she didn't just leave you the property. She established a conservation trust that specifically prohibits commercial development without approval from both the State Environmental Protection Agency and the Historical Preservation Society." "What does that mean?" "It means that even if you wanted to approve development plans, which you clearly don't, you couldn't do it unilaterally. Any changes to the land use would require extensive environmental reviews, historical impact studies, and public comment periods that could take years to complete." The implications were staggering. The merger timeline that both families had been so confident about was based on assumptions about property access that were legally impossible to fulfill. The entire foundation of their business plan was built on sand. They don't know, I realized aloud, about the conservation trust restrictions. Your father's lawyers apparently did very superficial research into the inheritance terms, Petra confirmed. They saw that you inherited the properties and assumed that meant you had unrestricted development rights. They never bothered to read the fine print. What happens when they find out? That depends on how quickly they can adapt their business plans, she said. The Asian shipping contracts they've been negotiating are contingent on having deep water port access by next spring. Without the Kiowa properties, they'll need to find alternative locations or risk losing the contracts entirely. I thought about the confidence both families had displayed during the merger announcement. The way they'd spoken about expansion timelines as if they were guaranteed rather than dependent on variables they didn't control. Their arrogance might be the key to dismantling their entire strategy. There's something else, Petra said, her expression growing more serious. I've been doing some research into the financial arrangements behind this merger. The loans your father took out to finance his portion of the expansion are secured by Nightingale Maritime's existing assets. If the merger fails, if the Asian contracts fall through, the company could face bankruptcy. And the Ashworths? They're in a similar position, she said. They've leveraged their international operations to finance this expansion. Without the guaranteed shipping routes through Charleston, they're overextended and vulnerable. The picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't just a strategic business arrangement. It was a desperate gamble by two families who had bet everything on a plan that depended on assets they didn't actually control. My inheritance wasn't just valuable, it was essential to preventing financial collapse for both maritime empires. What are you suggesting? I asked. I'm suggesting that you have more power in this situation than anyone realizes, Petra said. Including you. Over the following days, the fallout from the press conference continued to escalate. Environmental groups filed formal complaints about the development plans, triggering mandatory review processes that would delay any construction for months or years. Historical preservation societies launched investigations into the legal protections surrounding the Kiowa property. Most damaging of all, the Asian shipping partners began expressing concerns about the reliability of the expansion timeline. Damien's behavior toward me shifted from cold calculation to barely controlled fury. He no longer bothered to maintain the pretense of affection, treating me like an employee who had committed an act of corporate sabotage, which, from his perspective, was exactly what had happened. You have no idea what forces you're playing with, he warned me during one of our increasingly tense dinner conversations. This isn't some romantic novel where the plucky heroine wins by following her heart. This is business with real consequences for real people. You mean real consequences for your profit margins? I replied. I mean real consequences for hundreds of employees who will lose their jobs if this expansion fails. He shot back. I mean real consequences for your family's reputation, when it becomes public knowledge that a Nightingale sabotaged a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The threats were becoming more specific and more personal, but they only strengthened my resolve. If my actions could prevent the destruction of protected coastal land while also stopping people who had manipulated and betrayed me, then I was willing to accept whatever consequences came with that choice. The breakthrough came when I received a call from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a marine biologist who had been studying the ecosystem around my grandmother's properties for over a decade. She'd seen the news coverage of the merger controversy and wanted to share research that could be crucial to the environmental protection case. The wetlands on your property are home to a breeding population of painted buntings, she explained during our meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Charleston. They're considered a species of special concern, and any development that disrupts their habitat would violate multiple federal protection laws. How many people know about this? Just a handful of researchers and birdwatching enthusiasts, she said. But if this information were presented to the right environmental agencies, it would trigger an automatic moratorium on any development plan. I thought about my grandmother's love of birdwatching, the hours we'd spent on her cottage porch identifying species and recording their behaviors in a leather-bound journal she'd kept for decades. She would have known about the painted bunting. In fact, Protecting them might have been part of her motivation for establishing the Conservation Trust. What would you need to make this information public? I asked. Just your permission to file the necessary reports, Dr. Martinez said. As the property owner, your request for environmental protection review would carry significant legal weight. That afternoon, I signed documents that would trigger the most comprehensive environmental review in Charleston County's history. The process would take at least 18 months to complete, effectively killing any hope of meeting the merger's aggressive development timeline. When Damien discovered what I'd done, his mask of civilized behavior finally slipped completely. "You vindictive little bitch," he snarled, cornering me in our library like a predator stalking prey. "You're going to destroy both our families out of some misguided sense of romantic betrayal." "I'm protecting land that doesn't belong to you," I said, refusing to back down despite the menace in his voice. "That land is worthless without development," he spat. "Your sentimental attachment to some moldy old cottage is going to cost hundreds of people their livelihood. Then maybe you shouldn't have built your business plan on something you never had the right to use." For a moment, I thought he might actually strike me. His hands clenched into fists, and something dangerous flashed in his green eye. But then his phone rang, and he was forced to take another crisis management call from his increasingly panicked business partners. The next morning brought news that changed everything. The Charleston Post and Courier ran a front-page investigation into the merger, complete with leaked financial documents that revealed the extent to which both companies had leveraged their assets to finance the expansion. The headline read, "Maritime Merger Built on Environmental Deception," and the article painted a damning picture of corporate greed, trumping environmental protection. But more importantly, the article revealed information I hadn't known before. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of environmental violations in previous Ashworth development projects, including illegally filled wetlands and destroyed wildlife habitat. The reporter had also discovered that several regulatory permits for the Charleston expansion had been fast-tracked through connections with local politicians who had financial relationships with both maritime families. The story triggered a cascade of investigations by environmental agencies, ethics committees, and federal regulators. Within days, the Asian shipping contracts that formed the foundation of the merger were suspended pending the outcome of the environmental review. Stock prices for both companies plummeted as investors realized the expansion timeline was no longer viable. I watched the collapse unfold from the turret studio in our Battery mansion, painting watercolors of Charleston Harbor while my husband's business empire crumbled around him. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally free to pursue my art while the people who had dismissed my creativity scrambled to salvage their practical business arrangement. The final blow came when federal investigators arrived at our house with search warrants for financial documents related to the merger. Damien met them at the door with his team of lawyers, but there was nothing they could do to prevent the seizure of records that would expose the full extent of the manipulation and environmental deception. "This is all your fault," Damien accused me, as federal agents carried boxes of documents out of his study. "Your jealousy and vindictiveness have destroyed everything." "No," I said calmly, not looking up from my painting. "Your arrogance and greed destroyed everything. I just made sure it happened publicly." As the investigators loaded their evidence into black SUVs, I realized that I had achieved something more powerful than revenge. I had reclaimed agency over my own life while protecting something my grandmother had treasured. The painted buntings would continue to nest in the Kiowa wetlands. The historic cottage would remain a sanctuary for creativity and independence, and two manipulative families would face the consequences of treating people and places like disposable assets. The game they thought they'd won by marrying me off to secure business advantages had backfired spectacularly. They'd given me access to their plans, their resources, and their vulnerability. Most importantly, they'd underestimated the power of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The legal battles would continue for months, maybe years. The environmental reviews would proceed with methodical thoroughness. The federal investigations would expose corruption that went far beyond a single merger agreement. But as I sat in my grandmother's wedding dress, now carefully preserved in my closet like a battle trophy, I knew that the war was already won. They had used my love against me, but I had used their greed against them, and in the end, Truth and environmental protection had proven more powerful than money and manipulation. The painted buntings continued to sing in the Kiowa wetlands, just as my grandmother had always intended, and for the first time since my wedding day, I was finally free to choose my own future. 18 months after my wedding day, I stood on the wraparound porch of my grandmother's cottage, watching sunrise paint the Kiowa wetlands in shades of gold and coral. The painted buntings had returned for another nesting season, their bright plumage flashing through the Spartina grass as they went about their morning routines. The sound of their calls mixed with the gentle lapping of tidal creeks, creating a symphony that my grandmother would have treasured. The cottage itself had been restored to its original charm, freed from the legal limbo that had trapped it during the merger negotiation. Federal investigators had determined that the environmental violations and corruption charges against both maritime families made any development plans null and void. The conservation trust my grandmother had established was stronger than ever, ensuring that future generations would experience this sanctuary exactly as she'd intended. I'd moved back to the cottage 6 months ago after the divorce proceedings finally concluded. The legal battle had been brutal but necessary, with Damien's lawyers attempting every possible strategy to maintain some claim on the Kiowa properties. They'd failed spectacularly, partly because environmental law was unambiguous about protected wetlands, but mostly because the federal corruption investigation had exposed the fraudulent basis of the entire merger. The maritime empires that had seemed so powerful and permanent had crumbled with shocking speed once their environmental violations became public knowledge. Nightingale Maritime Holdings had been forced into bankruptcy, its assets sold to cover fines and legal settlement. Ashworth International had survived by divesting its domestic operations and retreating to smaller international markets, but Sterling Ashworth had resigned in disgrace, and Damien had been barred from holding executive positions in any publicly traded company. My father's fall from Charleston society had been particularly dramatic. Victor Nightingale, once the epitome of successful business leadership, now faced criminal charges for bribery, environmental fraud, and conspiracy. The man who had orchestrated my marriage as a business transaction was now learning about transactions of a different sort in federal court. Vivian had managed to avoid criminal charges by cooperating with investigators, but her role in the manipulation had effectively ended her career in Charleston's interconnected business community. She'd moved to Atlanta, where she was attempting to rebuild her reputation in a city that didn't know about her involvement in environmental fraud and family betrayal. My mother had retreated to their summer home in Asheville, claiming health issues that conveniently coincided with the media attention surrounding the corruption trials. She'd never acknowledged her role in arranging my marriage or expressed regret for treating me like a business asset. Some relationships, I'd learned, couldn't be salvaged once their true nature was exposed, but not all of my family had been complicit in the deception. Aunt Petra had become my closest ally and advisor, helping me navigate the legal complexities of environmental protection law, while also providing emotional support during the darkest moments of the divorce proceeding. She'd been the one to suggest I study marine biology, pointing out that my artistic eye might bring fresh perspectives to environmental research. The suggestion had led to my enrollment in a graduate program at the College of Charleston, where I was working on a thesis about coastal ecosystem preservation through community engagement. My art had evolved too, incorporating scientific illustration techniques that helped communicate environmental concepts to broader audiences. The paintings I created now served a purpose beyond personal expression. They were tools for education and advocacy. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had become both a mentor and a friend, guiding my research while also collaborating on publications that combined scientific data with visual storytelling. Our work had attracted attention from environmental organizations across the Southeast, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that felt infinitely more meaningful than the charity board positions my mother had once pushed me toward. The cottage had been transformed into something that honored both my grandmother's memory and my own evolving identity. The main living areas retained their historic charm, but I'd converted the sunroom into a studio where watercolor paintings dried beside scientific specimens and research. The guest bedroom had become a library filled with environmental science textbooks, field guides and journals documenting the seasonal changes in the wetland ecosystem. I'd also established the Evangeline Nightingale Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting coastal habitats through research, education, and community advocacy. The foundation operated from the cottage's converted carriage house, employing a small staff of researchers and educators who shared my passion for environmental protection. It was funded partly by my grandmother's trust, but mostly by settlements from the environmental lawsuits that had followed the merger collapse. The irony wasn't lost on me that the money two families had tried to steal through manipulation was now being used to protect the very ecosystem they'd planned to destroy. Environmental justice, it turned out, had a poetic sense of balance. Marcus Whitfield, the family lawyer who'd helped orchestrate the marriage merger, had been disbarred and faced criminal charges for his role in the environmental fraud. But before his legal troubles began, he'd provided crucial information about other vulnerable coastal properties that were being targeted for inappropriate development. The intelligence he'd shared had allowed environmental groups to establish protective measures before damage could occur. The painted buntings that nested in my wetlands had become something of a symbol for the conservation movement in South Carolina. Their presence on protected land served as proof that environmental protection and economic prosperity could coexist when development was approached thoughtfully rather than greedily. Birdwatching tours now brought visitors to the cottage regularly, providing sustainable income for the foundation, while also educating people about coastal ecosystem preservation. I often thought about the wedding reception where I'd first realized the true nature of my marriage. The ballroom at Magnolia Estate was still rented out for similar events, where other young women probably stood in designer gowns believing they were celebrating love when they might actually be participating in business transactions. The difference was that now Charleston society understood the consequences of treating people like commodities and environments like disposable resources. My divorce from Damien had been finalized 8 months ago, but I'd kept detailed records of everything that had transpired during our brief marriage. The documentation served multiple purposes. It provided evidence for ongoing environmental loss. It helped federal investigators understand the scope of corruption in Charleston's maritime industry, and it offered a complete account of how manipulation and environmental fraud had been disguised as romantic love and business innovation. Damien himself had disappeared from Charleston shortly after the criminal charges were filed. Rumors suggested he'd moved to Europe, where he was attempting to rebuild his career in shipping markets that weren't familiar with his history of environmental violation. I felt no bitterness about his departure, only relief that I would never again have to pretend affection for someone who'd treated my emotions like strategic resources to be exploited. The most unexpected outcome of the entire ordeal had been reconnecting with childhood friends who'd grown up outside Charleston's elite social circles, people like Isla Thorne who'd always been skeptical of Damien, but had never been able to articulate why. She'd become a regular visitor to the cottage, often bringing her own children to explore the wetlands and learn about environmental stewardship. "You've created something beautiful here," Isla said during one of her visits, watching her daughter sketch a great blue heron that had landed near the dock. "Your grandmother would be so proud." "I think she planned this," I replied, adjusting my wide-brimmed hat against the afternoons. The Conservation Trust, the environmental protections, even the specific language in her will. She knew exactly what she was doing when she left this place to me. "She knew you'd fight for it. She knew I'd learn to fight for it." I wasn't always someone who could stand up to corporate manipulation and family pressure, but circumstances have a way of teaching you capabilities you didn't know you possessed. The cottage had also become a retreat for other women who'd experienced similar manipulations, though few had faced schemes as elaborate as mine. The foundation offered residencies for artists, writers and researchers who needed space to heal from betrayal while also contributing to environmental protection efforts. The combination of creative expression and scientific purpose seemed to provide exactly the kind of restoration that traditional therapy often couldn't achieve. One of the current residents was a marine biologist from North Carolina whose research funding had been terminated when she'd refused to suppress data about industrial pollution in coastal waters. Another was a photographer documenting the effects of climate change on Barrier Island community. Their presence filled the cottage with intellectual energy, an environmental passion that would have delighted my grandmother, the legal battles weren't entirely finished. Environmental lawyers were still pursuing damages against companies that had participated in the illegal development schemes, and federal prosecutors continued investigating corruption in Charleston's municipal government. But the immediate threats to the Kiowa properties had been eliminated, and the precedent established by our case was being used to protect other vulnerable coastal areas throughout the Southeast. I'd also become something of an inadvertent expert on recognizing and resisting manipulation, leading to speaking engagements at universities and women's organizations. The story of how a wedding reception had revealed a massive environmental fraud scheme resonated with audiences who understood that personal betrayal and ecological destruction often shared the same root causes: the willingness to treat people and places as disposable resources, rather than irreplaceable treasure. The painted buntings outside my window were preparing for their autumn migration, but they'd return next spring to continue the cycle that had persisted here for thousands of years. Their presence reminded me that some things were worth protecting, regardless of their economic value, and that resistance to destruction could take many forms. As evening approached, I gathered my research notes and art supplies, preparing to head inside for dinner. The sunset painted the wetlands in shades of amber and crimson, creating exactly the kind of scene that had inspired my grandmother's own artistic pursuit. She'd understood that beauty and purpose weren't mutually exclusive, that protecting something precious often required both scientific knowledge and creative expression. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Martinez, sharing preliminary results from our latest research on climate change adaptation in coastal bird populations. The data was encouraging, suggesting that protected wetlands like mine were providing crucial refugia for species struggling to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Our work was making a difference that extended far beyond property lines and legal victories. I thought about the woman I'd been 18 months ago, standing in my grandmother's wedding dress and believing I was celebrating the beginning of a perfect marriage. That woman had been naive about many things, but she'd also possessed something valuable that manipulation couldn't touch: an instinctive understanding that love and respect were prerequisites for any meaningful relationship, whether personal or professional. The cottage lights reflected on the tidal creek as darkness settled over the wetlands, and I could hear the gentle sounds of nocturnal wildlife beginning their evening activity. Somewhere in the Spartina grass, painted buntings settled into roosts that would protect them through the night, preparing for another day of the ancient rhythms that had shaped this ecosystem for millennia. Tomorrow would bring new research projects, new visitors to the foundation, and new opportunities to combine scientific knowledge with artistic expression in service of environmental protection. The work was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it was work I'd chosen freely, without manipulation or coercion or hidden agenda. As I climbed the cottage steps and paused to look back at the wetlands one more time, I realized that I'd found something I'd been searching for without knowing it: not romantic love or family acceptance or social status, but purpose that aligned with my deepest values and capability. The painted buntings sang their evening songs, and I finally understood what my grandmother had meant when she'd written in her will that some inheritances were more valuable than money. The cottage door closed behind me with the soft click of coming home, and I began preparing for another day of protecting the irreplaceable treasures that surrounded me. The game they'd thought they'd won had transformed into something entirely different: a life worth living on my own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.